You know those jarring health headlines we see all the time? One day, coffee is a literal miracle cure, and the next, it's considered completely dangerous. It gets super overwhelming, right? So, how do scientists actually cut through all that noise to find the objective truth? Well, today, in this explainer, we're opening up the medical detective's toolkit to decode the brilliant science behind epidemiological studies. We're going to explore exactly how public health experts track down the true causes of disease.
How do we actually know what makes us sick? It's definitely not just about guessing or relying on some random anecdotes. When epidemiologists spot a pattern, they have to figure out if a specific exposure, like, say, smoking, a high-sodium diet, or a certain chemical, actually causes a disease, or if it's just a total coincidence. And to solve that puzzle, they rely on a very specific set of investigative designs.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll start with a quick snapshot, which is the cross-sectional study. Then, we'll look backward with case control studies, look forward with cohort studies, and finally, we'll arrive at the absolute gold standard, randomized controlled trials. Let's dive in.
Number 1. The snapshot, also known as cross-sectional studies.
Okay, so a cross-sectional study is basically an observational design that determines exposure and disease outcomes simultaneously for each participant, all at a single point in time. Think of it quite literally as taking a photograph of a population. You aren't following anyone forward or tracking them backward over time. It's kind of like surveying a town today to see exactly how many people have asthma and how many happen to live next to a factory. You're simply sampling a group and capturing the current prevalence of both the disease and the exposure right now in this exact moment.
Now, on the pro side, these are incredibly fast, super resource efficient, and they are absolutely fantastic for generating initial hypotheses about what might be causing a health issue. But there's a fatal flaw, and that's temporal ambiguity. Because you're measuring the exposure and the disease at the exact same moment, you run straight into the classic chicken or the egg problem. Unless you literally have a time machine, you absolutely cannot prove if the exposure came before the disease, or if getting the disease somehow changed the person's exposure habits. Plus, it suffers from survivor bias, because you're really only capturing people who survive long enough to even be included in your snapshot.
Moving on to number 2, looking backward with case control studies.
So because a snapshot can't actually prove what came first, we need a retrospective approach. In a case control design, we start right now, in the present day, by selecting 2 distinct groups. We've got our cases, who are individuals that are already sick with the disease, and our controls, who are perfectly healthy but come from that exact same population. Once we have our 2 groups, we track their patient histories backward in time. We're looking into the distant past to uncover what prior historical exposures might actually explain why the cases got sick and the controls didn't.
And this tool fundamentally changed public health history. Back in 1950, researchers Richard Dahl and Austin Bradford Hill used a case control design to investigate a massive sudden rise in lung cancer. By anchoring their study with lung cancer patients and healthy controls, and then carefully tracing their habits backward, they effectively ruled out other environmental factors and firmly linked the disease to heavy smoking. It was an absolute masterpiece of retrospective investigation.
So how do we actually calculate that link? Let's break down the odds ratio formula. Basically, we grid out our sick cases and healthy controls against whether they were exposed or unexposed to a specific risk factor. To find the odds ratio, we just do a simple cross-product calculation, A times D divided by B times C. This really elegant mathematical formula essentially asks, what are the odds that our sick patients were exposed to the risk factor in the past compared to the perfectly healthy controls?
But, as you might guess, looking backward has some pretty serious methodological pitfalls. The biggest threat here is recall bias. Think about it. A sick individual who is desperately searching for answers to their illness is going to scrutinize and maybe even misremember their past exposures way more intensely than a healthy control who has literally no reason to overanalyze their history. On top of that, recruiting a truly representative control group is incredibly difficult, which creates selection bias. And finally, this design just isn't ideal for evaluating really common diseases. It's definitely best reserved for tracking down rare conditions.
All right, number 3. Looking forward. Cohort studies.
If looking backward is full of biases, well, we need to look to the future. Cohort studies represent the absolute standard of excellence for observational epidemiology. The longitudinal flow here is entirely forward-facing. We start in the present day with individuals who are perfectly healthy and completely disease-free. We simply divide them based on their current habits into an exposed group and an unexposed group. Then, we track these cohorts forward longitudinally, sometimes for years or even decades, into the future to observe and compare who eventually develops the disease. The beauty of this is that it guarantees the exposure actually came before the illness.
To really ground this design in reality, let's look at the famous Framingham Heart Study. Researchers took a massive cohort of healthy people and meticulously tracked their lifestyle exposures, things like tobacco smoking, highly saturated fat diets, sedentary habits, over many, many years. By patiently watching who eventually developed heart disease and who stayed healthy, they successfully discovered the major cardiovascular risk factors that literally define modern preventative medicine today.
So how do we quantify this forward-looking data? We calculate something called relative risk, or RR. The formula takes the true incidence rate in the exposed group, which is A divided by A plus B, and divides it by the incidence rate in the unexposed group, so C divided by C plus D. Because we track them through time, we aren't just estimating odds anymore. We are directly comparing the actual biological incidence rates of new disease between the two distinct cohorts.
To make that math instantly practical for a second, a relative risk of 2.0 simply means the exposed group has exactly twice the risk of getting sick compared to the unexposed group.
But of course, observing people for years on end is not easy. Cohort studies are highly time-consuming and incredibly expensive to run. Furthermore, because you have to wait around for the disease to naturally occur, they are highly inefficient for evaluating rare diseases. You might wait a whole lifetime and never see a single case. But the most insidious structural threat here is attrition bias. If participants systematically drop out or are lost to follow-up over all those years of tracking, it can completely distort your calculated relative risk and basically ruin the study's validity.
Which brings us to number 4, the gold standard, randomized controlled trials or RCTs.
Up to this point, every single study we've talked about has been observational. That means researchers are merely observing natural behaviors without actually intervening. But experimental studies, like RCTs, are entirely different. Here, researchers actively allocate and control the exposure or treatment to directly test a hypothesis.
Let's map out exactly how this gold standard works. Step 1 is selecting your target population. But step 2 is where the real magic happens, randomization. Using a coin toss or a computer algorithm, participants are assigned purely by random chance to step 3, which is allocation to either the active treatment group or a placebo control. Finally, step 4 is comparing the final health outcomes. Now, why is randomization so incredibly powerful? Because random chance evenly distributes both known and unknown confounding factors between the groups. This ensures that the absolutely only fundamental difference between them is the treatment itself.
And to protect the integrity of that randomization, we apply blinding, sometimes called unmasking. This keeps the researchers and the participants completely unaware of who actually received the real treatment and who just got the placebo. This is absolutely critical to prevent expectation bias. I mean, if a patient expects a pill to cure them, or a doctor subconsciously really wants the treatment to work, those expectations can deeply influence the results. Blinding keeps all the data totally objective.
So RCTs are the undeniable gold standard for proving cause and effect. But consider this. If we suspect a new virus or a specific chemical exposure is deadly, is it ethical to actively randomize a group of people to test it? Absolutely not. You simply cannot ethically prescribe harm. And that is exactly why the observational tools in our toolkit, our snapshots, our retrospective deep dives, and our longitudinal cohorts remain so utterly essential. They allow us to protect public health and decode the natural world without causing any harm. It really makes you wonder, what massive medical mysteries will observational studies solve next?